Why do we pay money to have a bad time? We don't buy a ticket to a comedy hoping we won't laugh. We don't watch a romance hoping it will break our hearts. And we certainly don't go to an action movie hoping to feel genuinely threatened. But horror is different. We walk into a dark theater or sit on a couch, turn off our phones, and then spend the next 2 hours watching people get murdered, possessed, hunted, tortured, infected, or psychologically destroyed. And when the lights come back on, we say, that was great. So why? Why would anyone willingly seek out fear? Why do some people actually love being scared? And perhaps even stranger, why does horror seem to be one of the few genres that can still make a massive audience show up for something they've never heard of before? At its most basic level, horror makes a very strange promise. For a short while, it's going to make you believe something terrible is happening. Your heart rate goes up, your muscles tense. You become hyper aware of every sound. You start scanning the frame, looking for something hiding in the darkness. And yet, you're sitting on a couch or in a cinema. You can pause the movie, you can look away. You know there's an exit. And somewhere in your brain, you know the monster isn't actually coming through the screen. That's the fundamental trick. Horror creates a situation where the emotional response can be real even though the danger isn't. And researchers studying recreational fear have found something particularly interesting. Enjoyment isn't highest when people are barely frightened, nor when they're completely overwhelmed. It tends to form an inverted U relationship with fear. In other words, there's a sweet spot. Enough fear to make your body react, but enough safety and control to make the experience enjoyable. Thus, fear becomes part of the fun. But this still doesn't explain something. Why actively search for horror? One explanation is sensation seeking. Some people are simply more attracted to intense and novel experiences, and research has repeatedly linked sensation seeking with greater interest in horror and other intense media. This can't explain everyone, because plenty of horror fans aren't adrenaline junkies. Some people hate roller coasters. They hate haunted houses. They hate being startled. And yet they'll happily watch a 2-hour movie about a family being hunted by a demon. Maybe it's curiosity. There's a psychological concept called morbid curiosity, the tendency to seek information about dangerous, threatening, or disturbing things. And horror is basically a machine designed to feed that curiosity. The movie gives us a mystery. Our fear makes us want the answer, which creates this strange loop. We want to look away, but we also need to see what happens next. Horror also gives us something real life rarely does: control. Think about real fear. Real anxiety is messy. It doesn't come with a soundtrack. It doesn't have a running time. It doesn't give you an explanation. And you don't know when it will end. Movie horror does. It gives fear boundaries. You can enter the darkness voluntarily and leave it voluntarily. That distinction matters. Research into horror suggests that frightening films can function as a kind of emotional rehearsal, allowing people to experience threatening situations and think through how they respond to them in a controlled environment. You're watching someone hide from a killer. You're watching someone survive an outbreak. You're watching someone confront the thing they're afraid of. And even if you never consciously think, what would I do? Your brain is still following the problem. Where would I hide? Would I notice that? Why didn't they run? How would I survive? Horror turns fear into a puzzle, and solving the puzzle can feel satisfying. There's a reason horror movies are so effective in theaters. Fear is contagious. When the entire room jumps, you jump. When somebody screams, everybody reacts. And then, almost immediately, the tension breaks. People laugh. They look at each other. They make jokes. Did you see that? The fear becomes a shared experience. Research comparing people experiencing frightening material alone versus in groups has found that being around others can change perceptions of threat. Horror isn't simply an individual experience. It's social. You're not just surviving the movie, you're surviving it together. And that might explain why people love going to horror movies with friends. The movie scares you, and then the group helps you recover. And this may be the main reason horror has lasted. Horror can turn abstract fears into physical things. Death becomes a monster. Disease becomes an infection. Grief becomes a ghost. Isolation becomes a haunted house. Violence becomes a killer. Loss of control becomes possession. Social collapse becomes zombies. And because those fears are disguised as stories, it's easier to look at a monster than it is to look directly at ourselves. Get Out turns racism into horror. Hereditary transforms grief and trauma into a monster. Infection movies became especially resonant during a period of heightened anxiety around disease. The important thing is that horror doesn't always have to consciously set out to become an allegory. Sometimes a culture's fears simply leak into the stories it creates. The genre becomes a kind of psychological mirror, and perhaps that's why horror feels particularly relevant during unstable periods. When everything feels uncertain, horror makes uncertainty visible. When the future feels threatening, horror gives that threat a face. There is another, much less philosophical reason horror survives. It's incredibly efficient. You don't need $100 million budget to frighten someone. You don't need explosions. You don't need exotic locations. Sometimes you need one room, one actor, a strange sound, a dark hallway, and enough imagination. A shadow can be scarier than a monster we see clearly. A closed door can be more frightening than an expensive creature effect. An unknown actor can make a movie feel more unpredictable. And because horror is fundamentally about creating an emotional experience, a small movie can compete with something 10 times its budget. Contained locations, unknown actors, atmosphere, and suggestion can actually strengthen horror rather than expose a lack of money. That's one reason horror can still produce breakout films from relatively unknown filmmakers. Maybe there isn't one answer. Some of us love the adrenaline. Some love the mystery. Some love gore. Some want to test themselves. Some love the atmosphere. Some want to understand the monster. Some want to laugh at how ridiculous it all is. And some people simply enjoy the feeling of being scared while knowing they're safe. But underneath all those differences is something remarkably human. We are creatures built to fear danger, and yet we also want to understand it. We want to look into the darkness. We want to know what's there. We want to imagine what might happen. And sometimes, we even want to walk toward it. That's what makes horror such a strange form of entertainment. It takes one of the most unpleasant things our brains can produce, fear, and turns it into a game, a story, a mystery, a social experience. Sometimes even a way of processing things we're afraid to confront in real life. We don't watch horror because we want to be afraid. We watch because, for a couple of hours, horror lets us feel fear without being powerless to it. We can enter the darkness, knowing there's always a way back out. Even after decades of monsters changing, killers changing, technology changing, and audiences changing, we still turn off the lights, press play, and wait for something in the dark to move. Or maybe, just maybe, the reason we love horror movies is because they're the only thing that can still make our dead hearts beat.